You're listening to the boring history for sleep, how Viking sailors told time by watching walruses, a slow-paced, gently told bedtime journey through one of the strangest timekeeping methods in history. So fluff your pillow, settle in, and let's drift into the North Atlantic together. Hey guys, tonight we sail north, not just north, like a weekend hiking trip, but north like your eyelashes freeze when you blink. You're standing on the deck of a creaking Viking longship as it glides through a fog that smells like wet pine and regret. The sky is a pewter smear. The fjords tower around you like ancient stone teeth. You're cold, underfed, probably seasick, and you have absolutely no idea what time it is. There's no ticking wristwatch here, no glowing phone screen, not even a sundial, because let's be honest, the sun bailed hours ago. It's somewhere behind that wool-thick sky, and you're pretty sure it's been dusk for 3 days straight. Welcome to Viking timekeeping, where approximately now-ish is an acceptable measurement, and your best clock might be a pile of walruses snoring on a distant rock. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're tuning in from somewhere odd or cozy, post your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where you're all drifting off from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge to the prow, boots slipping on salt-streaked wood, and stare out at the gray chop. The crew around you grumbles in Old Norse. They're not watching the waves or the sky. No, their eyes are fixed on a cluster of wet, tusked lumps bobbing on a rocky outcrop like someone spilled their weird meatball soup. Walruses. Big, leathery, faintly judgmental walruses, and yes, they're just lying there, but the crew watches them like they're reading a watchtower clock. One of the older sailors mutters something and begins preparing a meal. Another sharpens his axe, not for battle, but because he always sharpens it right before the walruses shift position, which, oddly enough, they're about to do. See, walruses aren't just background wildlife here. To the Vikings, they're a sort of blubbery, tusked hourglass. These sea beasts followed deeply ingrained haul-out routines, coming ashore in groups, resting at certain tides, snorting and shifting like grumpy retirees. And the Viking crews, not ones to waste an opportunity, began to notice patterns. Mainstream historians agree. The Vikings were exceptional sailors for their time, navigating using stars, birds, watercolor, even cloud shapes. But when conditions grew foul, and every celestial marker was missing, they turned to walruses. Fringe theorists, and at least one very confident Icelandic folktale, claimed that walruses were consulted, almost like oracle beasts, living tide clocks, whose behavior could help determine rowing schedules, meal prep, and even when to sleep. Historians still argue whether these habits were truly dependable, or just the fevered guesses of half-frozen men desperate for structure. But in the long, slow swirl of subarctic summer twilight, when minutes melted into meaningless mush, watching walruses became a mistakes, oddly soothing ritual. You crouch beside a thick-set sailor named Avent, who smells like fermented fish. In confidence, he nods toward the shore. Middle one twitched. That means it's near midday, he says, utterly serious. You blink. Midday. The light hasn't changed since last Tuesday, but Avent's already scooping dried grains into a boiling pot. Around him, the rest of the crew adjusts their tasks as if some great bell had rung. The walrus has spoken. You settle onto a barrel, back aching, and try to spot the twitch again. Maybe you'll get good at this. Maybe you'll become a walrus time savant. Then again, maybe you've been at sea too long, and your brain's just politely exiting your skull. Somewhere nearby, a gull screeches. It sounds like it's laughing. Time drips slowly aboard a Viking ship. It doesn't tick, it seeps. You sleep in shifts, row in shifts, eat when told, and guess the hour by which body part hurts the least. The only consistent markers are the beasts you pass: whales, seals, seabirds, and most famously, walruses. And unlike the fleeting flash of a bird or the deep vanish of a whale, walruses stay. They're like anchor points in a sea of confusion, round, grunting lighthouses. The crew knows which rocks they favor, which ones get early morning flops versus late evening loafs. You've never paid so much attention to a group of napping animals in your life. That night, though it's hard to call it night when it still looks like overcast 5 p.m., the sky thickens and the wind picks up. The walruses have vanished. Haven frowns. They don't leave unless it's storming, he mutters. 15 minutes later, rain slices sideways and the sea kicks up like it's personally offended. You pull your cloak tighter and squint at the ghostly shapes vanishing into the mist. The walruses were right. You survived the squall, barely, wet, sore, half delirious. The ship smells like soaked wool and regret. But when the fog lifts, the walruses are back, same rock, same lazy stack, like nothing happened. You can't help but respect them, eventually. After what might be days, or merely a very long afternoon, land appears, a rocky outcrop with a thin beach. The captain nods, and you beach the ship. The crew disembarks to stretch their legs. You, meanwhile, walk over to the walruses and sit at a polite, non-tusk stabbing distance. They don't acknowledge you. They barely move, but you swear the one in the middle gives a slow blink, like a nod from an old clock. You're starting to understand Viking time now. It's not about seconds or schedules. It's about rhythms, patterns, trusting the land, the sea, and, sometimes, the snoring blob of blubber that's always lying just where it should be. You wake on damp moss with the smell of seaweed in your nose and the distant sound of walrus barks echoing off the cliffs. The crew has already begun boiling breakfast, if you can call a lukewarm bowl of barley mash breakfast. Evan hands you a wooden spoon without looking up. They're early today, he mutters, chin jerking toward the beach. The walruses are back. Same formation, same rock. But today, they've shifted, spread out more than usual, like melting candle wax. One is even in the shallows, snorting at the waves, as if delivering a weather forecast in a language made entirely of bubbles and disdain. You chew your barley and try to spot the pattern. That one was lying closer to the left rock yesterday, and that grumpy-looking one with the scarred tusk is the one who usually lumbers ashore after the others, not before. It's subtle, but the crew notices. They're watching. This is the squishy secret of Viking time. Walruses, as it turns out, are surprisingly predictable. If you're desperate enough, modern studies confirm that walruses tend to haul out, meaning come ashore and rest at regular intervals, often tied to tidal shifts, feeding cycles, and weather changes. The Vikings didn't have marine biology degrees, but they had decades of observation, passed down like seafaring scripture. If a rock was empty when it was supposed to be full, or if the walruses moved to higher ground, the crew took it seriously. It wasn't just about time, it was about mood. A tense crew member might glance at a wriggling walrus and mutter, "Bad omen." Another would nod, pack his gear, and double-check the ropes. A third might casually tie his helmet strap a little tighter. You, meanwhile, are still trying to understand how any of this is supposed to correlate with when lunch should happen. Historians still argue whether the Vikings genuinely used walruses as systematic timekeepers, or if it was more about storytelling, superstition, and the human tendency to see patterns in clouds and creatures. But archaeological digs in Norse Greenland and coastal Iceland have turned up walrus remains alongside domestic goods and imported timepieces, suggesting these animals were more than just dinner options. And no, they didn't wear little wristwatches or get training in time cues, but their slow, blubbery consistency may have served a role closer to that of a temple bell than a pocket watch. You watch a young sailor named Herf tiptoe toward the rock shelf, as if sneaking up on a nap. He squints, frowns, returns to the group and whispers, "Only 3 are breathing. Yesterday it was 5. I think it's 1/2 past." No one knows what he means, but everyone nods like it makes perfect sense. Later that afternoon, or at least in what passes for afternoon, under this stubborn twilight, you follow a coastal path toward a small promontory overlooking the sea. The walruses below are shifting, grunting, occasionally flopping. You lean against a lichen-covered boulder and realize you've developed a strange affection for these creatures. They look like sacks of wheezing potatoes, and yet they command the respect of hardened warriors. Maybe it's their unbothered presence. They don't care if you raid England. They don't care if you row through storms or burn monasteries. They just lie there, in their own time, following rhythms older than ships or stories. You start to notice other things too. The subtle order in their arrangement. The biggest ones seem to pick the highest points. The young ones crowd together in cozy clusters, like overheated bread rolls. Occasionally, one flops toward the water, triggering a chain of sluggish repositionings like a gelatinous domino line, and that's when it hits you. The Vikings weren't reading the walruses like clocks. They were syncing with them, matching their pace, learning to live on walrus time, a soft, slow, sea-scented way of marking the hours, not by seconds, but by snorts. That evening, a fog rolls in again, thick enough to taste. The captain decides to wait it out on land. Campfires are lit. The crew roasts dried fish and hums low songs that sound like someone mumbling in their sleep. You lie back against a driftwood log, wrapped in a seal-hide cloak, and watch the silhouettes on the rocks. They're still there. Those fleshy monks of the north. One bellows, long and low, like a distant horn muffled by years. It echoes strangely across the water, bouncing from cliff to sail. No one flinches. They've heard it before. According to Avend, that call usually comes just before dawn, even though there's no sun to prove it. You close your eyes and try to listen past the walrus's voice to the rhythm underneath. The quiet breathing of beasts in tide, the hush of moss and fog, the drip of time melting like snow from a roof. Somewhere in the dark, a crew member sighs and says, "Guess it's nearly first meal." Someone else grunts. Fires are stoked. Kettles hiss. The night continues like an endlessly rewound tape. You don't check a clock. You don't need one anymore. Walrus time has you now. You're starting to forget what a clock even is. The idea of neat, numbered hours ticking along in perfect order seems laughably uptight now. Here, surrounded by sagas and sea spray, time is soft and wobbly, more like soup than sand. And today, you're about to stir that soup with some Viking innovation. The ship sets sail again, skimming along the cold edge of the world. The walruses are gone for now, their blubbery wisdom left behind on slippery rocks. So the crew turns to something else: sun compasses, shadow sticks, even fire smoke. They have a whole toolkit of strange, questionable gadgets that make you think someone once tried to invent a clock using driftwood and blind optimism. One sailor leaf, eternally shirtless despite the wind, pulls out a curious little disc of carved wood. It's no bigger than your palm and etched with radial lines, like a wheel from a goat-drawn pocket watch. "Sunstone and shadowboard," he says proudly. Although it's cloudy and the sun is busy doing a convincing impression of a brick wall, you squint. He holds the disc flat, then rotates it slowly. A tiny stick in the center is meant to cast a shadow, but right now, it looks like a sulking toothpick. The idea, Leaf explains, is to read the angle of the shadow against the etched lines to tell the time of day. Of course, that only works when there's actual sunlight. So, what do they do when the sky is a moldy bedsheet and the world is nothing but gray? They watch the smoke. No, really. When camped, Viking sailors would burn specific kinds of wood or blubber, because the direction and intensity of the smoke gave them clues not just about wind, but about moisture, pressure, and, allegedly, the hour. Whale smoke goes thin before sunrise, Avon tells you one evening, feeding dried fat into the fire, thick after dusk. You're skeptical, but he points to a flicker in the flame and nods solemnly, as if the smoke just whispered the date into his beard. Fringe theorists have proposed all sorts of Viking timekeeping tricks. Some say they used the direction of seabird migrations to judge late afternoon. Others claim they trained their own senses, tuning their stomachs, breath, and even hair growth to gauge how long they'd been at sea. One sagely suggests that the third itch of the shoulder always means it's time to change rowing crews. Historians still argue whether these methods were real or retroactive romanticism stories crafted by bored scribes and overly poetic saga composers. But one thing's for sure, when the sky failed them, the Vikings got weirdly creative. You wander the deck, watching the crew lean on their routines. One man sharpens his blade always, just before what passes for evening. Another stirs the soup pot with precisely 11 rotations, as if counting them holds the day together. There's comfort in ritual, even if it's nonsense. That night, clouds finally part. A thin, low sun slices across the horizon, like a half-forgotten promise. The air glows orange and gold, and the sea becomes a sheet of metal hammered flat by. Some divine blacksmith. Leaf leaps into action with his sun-shadowed disc. He squints, places it flat on a crate, and lets the stick cast its shadow across the etched grooves. Everyone gathers. Nearly 6th hour, he declares. No one knows what that means, but they nod respectfully. You try it yourself. The stick's shadow is shaky, and the lines blur under your tired eyes, but something about it feels real, grounding, like you're holding a tiny map of the sun's mood. By morning, the clouds return. Naturally, you descend into a new realm of Viking timekeeping, now gut feeling. That ancient half-magical sense of about now that comes from rowing in rhythm with the sea, sleeping when the wind lulls, and knowing the hour because your knees start to ache in a particular way. One man wakes and mutters, "It's breakfast time." He's right. Not because he saw a clock, but because his stomach said so. And so did the wind. And so did the faint gurgle of walruses burping somewhere on shore. You begin to sense it too, the subtle cues of Viking time. When your boots start to squelch, it's nearly midday. When the salt crust on your lips sharpens, it's probably late afternoon. And when the sea sings low and your eyes drift shut, that's a perfectly valid form of midnight. Sometimes, though, they get it wrong. A misjudged moment leads to rowing into a tide change, and the ship nearly grounds on a hidden reef. The captain blames the sun disk. Leaf blames the walruses. Evan blames bad omens and sprinkles salt over the side like it's an apology. You'll learn quickly that Viking timekeeping isn't about precision. It's about narrative, about choosing which story you believe. The one the smoke tells, the one the walrus whispers, or the one your knees insist is true. And slowly, your own inner clock starts to shift. You stop asking, "What time is it?" Instead, you start asking, "What does the sea feel like right now?" Or, "Does the air smell like morning?" There's a kind of peace in it, because when time is just a suggestion, and clocks are optional, you get to decide which heartbeat to follow. It's the 4th day, or maybe the 8th. Honestly, you've lost count, and that's the point. You wake to a silence so big, it feels loud. The kind of silence where the sea flattens like someone ironed it, and the wind holds its breath. The crew moves slowly this morning, like their bodies are underwater. There are no walruses in sight, no sun either, just mist curling over the rails, and a horizon that refuses to define itself. And yet the ship keeps moving. You lean against the mast and glance up. A few stars twinkle faintly above the Mista cosmic breadcrumb trail. The Vikings are already reading them like road signs. These aren't sailors who just go where the wind tells them. They know how to read the sky like it's whispering secrets, not in hours, but in directions. You spot Avond again, this time pointing at a patch of sky with his bone-handled knife. "There," he says. "That's Frostjent's nail." You have no idea which star he means, but it sounds serious. The rest of the crew adjusts the sail. Apparently, Frostjent's nail always points toward home around this time of something. Star navigation was a Viking superpower. They knew how to track the rising and setting of key constellations across seasons. Polaris, the North Star, was a staple, of course. But they also followed less famous celestial guides with names like Whale's Beard and Thor's Toe. One star for every tale. One direction for every dream. Historians still argue whether Vikings truly used a sunstone, a crystal, that supposedly allowed them to locate the sun's position even on cloudy days. Some say it's myth. Others say it's brilliant optics lost to time. Either way, you don't have one. You have clouds, and fog, and walruses. Well, not today, but you do have sound. That evening, as the mist grows heavier, you hear something that makes your skin prickle. A deep, vibrating bellow, far off in the gloom. It rolls across the water like thunder had a burp and decided to echo it for eternity. You know that sound now. Walruses. The ship adjusts course, not toward the walruses, necessarily, but in response. To them, their voices carry far, low frequency, and bone deep. It's like someone ringing a fog bell made of beef. And if you listen closely, you can hear patterns in their noise, the staggered pauses, the length of the calls, the strange rhythm that builds between them. According to the crew, different calls mean different things. One is a warning, another, signals gathering. A third, more drawn-out version, supposedly indicates feeding time, which, if you're a Viking sailor, is basically lunchtime. So yes, in the absence of the sun, or moon, or even the smell of soup, you now tell time by listening to walrus ballads. The sound alone could be a lullaby, if it weren't so weird, deep and breathy, like someone trying to sing through a didgeridoo underwater. But out here, with the fog pressing against your face and the cold nipping at your toes, it becomes a comfort. A reliable tick-tock made of breath and beast. One of the younger sailors, Freitas, barely old enough to braid her beards, sits cross-legged near the bow, humming in sync with the walruses. You catch her tapping her fingers against her leg. For taps, pause. 3. She's syncing to them, like a drummer, with a very odd band. There's an old Norse belief that the sea has a heartbeat, that if you lie very still in a longship, you can feel it thumping below the boards. And sometimes, that beat lines up perfectly with a walrus call, and when it does, that's how you know you're on time, not in hours or minutes, but in harmony with the sea itself. You close your eyes and try to feel it. The rhythm of the ship, the bellow of the walruses, the pulse of the tide. You do feel something. Maybe it's just your own heartbeat. Maybe it's the ship's. Or maybe, just maybe, it's time, drifting past you like fog over waves. By the next day, the fog has thinned. The walruses have shifted closer, their shapes now visible lumpy and immobile, on a nearby beach. They haven't moved much, but their calls continue. Like monks chanting from a distant abbey made of driftwood and fish breath. The captain checks the sail tension, eyes the walruses, then mutters, "We've missed second watch." No one argues. The walruses didn't moan on cue this time, and the sun still refuses to show up for work. You wonder if maybe the walruses are just bored, or sleepy, or sick of being timekeepers for a species that keeps inventing complicated ways to ask, "Are we there yet?" But the Vikings don't see it that way. To them, the walrus is part of the story, a slow, snotty metronome. The idea that an animal's voice could echo across miles and mark a moment feels natural out here. You can't hear a clock in the fog, but you can hear a walrus. That night, someone sings an old lullaby, the kind with 5 verses, each one slower than the last. It speaks of tides and tusks and a sea that only sleeps when the walrus hums it. A song. You drift off with that melody in your head, And somewhere, just out of sight, time bellows softly into the night. You open your eyes to an endless canvas of pale gray light. Again, it's not night. It's not really day. It's just ... there. Like the world is stuck in a permanent shrug. You stretch, joints stiff from sleeping in the same tunic for what feels like a month. Around you, the crew is already awake, passing around salted fish and hard bread that tastes vaguely of pine. There's no sun in the sky, no bells to chime, but somehow, everyone seems to know it's time to eat. How do you know it's morning? You finally ask Avind, who's busy gnawing something that may or may not be food. He grins without teeth. Because we're hungry. Welcome to the Viking experience, a time without hours. See? Back home, you might be used to time being chopped into little boxes. 7:30 is breakfast. 12 o'clock is lunch. 3:15 is when your brain checks out and you start Googling how long can one nap before it becomes a coma. But here, aboard a creaking longship with no clocks, time is broken up differently. In the Viking world, you mark your day by what your body and the boat are doing. Time is measured in rowing shifts, cooking fires, and how many blisters have formed on your hands. And the walruses, still part of the schedule, but they're more like background music now, a grunting reminder of nature's consistency. Historians still debate whether the Vikings truly operated with watches. In the naval sense, structured rotations of rest, rowing, and watchkeeping. Some evidence from sagas and ship remains suggests they may have used basic shift systems, perhaps divided into thirds or quarters of a day, but not with the strict precision of later navies. What they did have, however, was a collective rhythm. Meals happened when the fish was soft enough. Sleep began when the sea was calm or the bodies collapsed. And those odd, gasping barks from a walrus colony across the water, they often coincided with the end of a rowing cycle or the start of a new fire. Coincidence? Maybe. But after weeks in this drifting, rotting oak canoe of fate, you begin to feel the rhythms too. You row and row and row until someone taps your shoulder and says, "That's enough." You look up, breathless. No clock has told them this, but they know. Your arms know too. The crew swaps in another set of rowers, and the cycle continues. In summer, especially in the far north, night doesn't fall the way it should. The sun hovers near the horizon like a bad houseguest who won't leave. It glows dimly, painting the sea in hues of gold and steel, but never dips low enough to give true darkness that messes with your head. You start forgetting when to sleep, or if you already have. Time stretches into a taffy pull of vague moods and confused bowels. People start measuring days by how many times they've changed shirts, if at all. A young sailor named Alrek invents his own system. He names every pseudo-hour of the day after fish. "It's pickled trout time," he says, lighting the fire. "Almost smoked eel o'clock." No one laughs. It actually helps. You begin tracking moments by personal signs, the sting of sea salt in your eyes, the squeak of wet boots, the way the sun glints off Avon's forehead just before the soup boils over. These are your new hours. One morning, though, who even knows anymore? You step onto a rocky shore with the crew to gather supplies. As you haul up driftwood, you spot them again, the walruses, dozens of them, piled like bags of laundry, snoring and farting in harmony. And something about them soothes you, not because they mark a specific hour, but because they anchor the experience. They're always there, always doing the same thing, unbothered, unchanging. You sit on a rock near them, not close enough to get tusk-tanned. Listen, a deep bellow rises from one, long and tired. A few moments later, another replies, then silence, then a sneeze. You glance at your ship. Already, people are stirring for a meal. Somewhere deep in Viking culture, time has become less about when and more about what. Not it's 2 o'clock, but it's when the walruses wake up. Not it's midnight, But it's when our hands go numb and our jokes stop being funny. You hear someone yell, third burp. A laugh follows. Apparently, a certain walrus has bellowed 3 times in a row. The crew moves to check their gear. At this point, you're not sure if the walruses are predicting time, or if everyone's just collectively pretending they are because it gives meaning to the blur. And honestly, that's kind of beautiful. You wander back to the ship as the crew finishes preparing another simple meal. You sit cross-legged on the deck, biting into dried fish, listening to the waves lap gently. There are no bells, no alarms, no deadlines. Only rhythm, walrus rhythm, and maybe that's the secret. When everything else vanishes, sunlight clocks. Even solid land you measure life, not by the hour, but by the heaving breath of the sea, the yawning of walruses, and the quiet murmurs of people who've long since stopped asking what time it is. Because you're not chasing time anymore, you're floating in it. You're knee-deep in cold brine, dragging a fishing net through a rocky inlet, when Avond looks up suddenly and says, "Time to pack up." No clock, no sundial, not even a grunt from a walrus this time. He just knows. How, you ask, straightening, with a spine that sounds like a gravel path. He points with his chin toward the sea. The ice is moving. You turn and stare. Sure enough, thin plates of sea ice are drifting differently closer together now, bumping like drunk dinner guests at a Viking feast. They were farther apart an hour ago, or was it yesterday? The timeline's a bit soggy at this point. This is your next lesson. Ice clocks and gut instincts. In the North Atlantic, time isn't just a number, it's a shift in the wind, a tone in the waves, a slight change in the way a gull screams. And especially, it's the ice. The way it drifts, the way it cracks, the way it sometimes disappears altogether. For the Vikings, especially those sailing in the icy reaches of Greenland and Vinland, watching the ice was as vital as watching the stars. Mainstream historians agree that Norse seafarers knew the seasonal behaviors of pack ice well. Entire voyages were scheduled around it, ice retreats, ice advances, even the sounds of it breaking apart like old wood underfoot. Some records from Iceland suggest that certain journeys were planned a week past first ice melt, or when the sea ice breathes thin. You don't see the ice breathe, but you hear it, as your longship shoves off again. Scraping gently across the gravelly shore, you hear the low groan of distant bergs, a deep, ancient moan like the earth trying to remember its password. The crew listens, adjusts sails, changes heading. No need for a sextant. The ice is telling them the time. The walruses are gone again, off to some other calendar rock, but now, it's your body that steps in. You row, then rest, then row again, and your arms seem to know when it's time to switch. You smell the salt in the air, and guess whether it's midday based on how dry your tongue feels. You notice the grain of the wind, whether it's hitting. You're back at a new angle. These are your hours now. Avond teaches you a trick. Feel the inside of your boot. If it's cold and dry, it's early. If it's warm and squishy, the day's worn on. Disgusting, but oddly effective. Then there's the seaweed test. Leaf grabs a clump of wet kelp from the ship's edge and holds it to his nose. If it smells sweet, it's still early. If it smells like old fish, stew, and shame, we're near evening. You raise an eyebrow, and if it smells like nothing, he shrugs. Then we're probably lost. Historians still argue whether the Vikings truly based parts of their navigation and timekeeping on sensory cues like smell and humidity. Some scholars scoff, others point to surviving poetry that hints at it, cryptic verses about when the water sweats and the birds won't speak. Romantic nonsense. Maybe, or maybe a subtle nod to instinct as a clock, because that's the real magic here. Instinct. Your gut becomes your watch. You start to wake up right before someone calls for the sail to be hoisted. You hunger just as the cooking starts. You look toward land a few seconds before it appears. It's not supernatural. It's not divine. It's just you, syncing up with the rhythm of the sea, the ship, and the soft, squishy tempo of Viking life. At one point, a storm threatens to roll in. Black clouds build fast. The wind shifts. The walruses long, good aren't there to warn you this time, but you still feel it coming. You feel it in the pressure behind your eyes, the sudden bitterness in your mouth, the way the seagulls vanish without so much as a scream. Avent grabs the tiller. We've got until the second gust. What's a second gust? No one explains. But you brace the sail anyway, just before the sky peels open and the sea turns violent. It passes, like everything does. Soaked and freezing, you curl under a blanket of rough wool, waiting for your pulse to stop impersonating a war drum. Leaf lies next to you, whispering, "That was fifth-hour weather." Always hits around then. You have questions. So many questions. But sleep takes you before you ask. The next morning, or what feels like it, you crawl out from under the tarp and watch Avent watching the ice again. The drift has reversed. "Backtide's coming," he says. "Afternoon," you nod. He's probably right. Back in your world, time is sliced and diced, squeezed into notifications and caffeine boosts. But out here, it swells and dips. It's in the bones of things, in the smell of your boots, in the way the ship creaks like it's sighing after a long week. You check the sky. The clouds are low. The wind smells like burnt fish and pine sap. It's walrus time again, even if the walruses aren't here. It starts with a joke because, of course it does. You're halfway through another grim bowl of porridge, and Leaf, whose beard seems to have doubled in size overnight, says, "Judging by the state of my chin forest, I reckon it's Thursday." The others laugh. You do too. But then you pause. Because, wait, Leaf's beard has grown. So has Avon's. So has yours. In fact, if you think about it, you've noticed their faces changing more than the sky, and suddenly, you're introduced to the most delightfully unreliable Viking timekeeping device of all, the beard meter method. In a world where the sun barely shows up to work, and clocks don't exist, facial hair became, at least for some, a running gag, and a rough marker of time. Some Viking tales mention men swearing oaths by how long their beards would grow. "I'll return before my chin bristles touch my belly," one might say. And it wasn't entirely poetic nonsense. When you're at sea for weeks, maybe months, beards become calendars with bad memory. You don't know the hour, but you can say, "It's been 4 face scratches since we left Reykjavik," and this isn't just for laughs. In the absence of rigid time systems, Norse sailors often resorted to tracking their lives through bodily changes: beard length, hunger cycles, clothing decay. They'd joke about it, sure, but they used it too. You touch your own chin, stubble, coarse, definitely longer than when this journey began. You glance at your sleeves, more salt-stiff than before. Your boots have started to soften at the seams. Is this how time works now? Historians still debate whether the Vikings truly used personal physical cues as calendars, or if these were just saga embellishments meant to spice up an otherwise soggy existence. But considering how deeply embedded observation and oral storytelling were in Viking culture, it's not outlandish to imagine a sailor saying, "Judging by the ripeness of this sock, we've been gone 2 weeks. Other methods crop up too. Fish stink. Yes, really. You begin to notice the way the ship itself changes, scent over time. Fresh sails have a certain flax smell, but as days pass, they sour. Salt cod gets sharper. Rope, when damp for too long, gives off a tang that clings to your nose hairs. Avon's armpits, for instance, could probably tell the difference between morning and evening shifts on their own. You joke that his underarm has a 12-hour cycle. He's not offended. He simply lifts his arm and solemnly sniffs, then declares it early stink o'clock. You're also introduced to the soup timer. You see, the ship's cook, a woman named Torvi, insists that stew thickness is a better indicator than any bow stick. "Thin soup means early," she says, swirling the pot. "By sundown, it thickens. Always. And bizarrely, it does. Could be the salt content. Could be magic. Could just be that Torvi adds more fish heads the longer the pot's been bubbling. Either way, no one questions it. You begin logging your own data mentally, of course. You note how your back twinges a little earlier each day, how your right foot starts to cramp before meals. These aren't numbers. They're experiences. Time in the Viking world isn't arithmetic. It's felt. And then there are the smells. You find yourself associating certain scents with parts of the day. The sour salty temps of drying fish morning, the smoky fat of boiling meat midday, the musky rot of wet wool definitely night. One afternoon, if it is afternoon, a light drizzle begins to fall. The ship creaks. The crew begins adjusting things without being told. No orders are shouted. They just know, because by now, everyone's inner clock has synced to something deeper. To the creak of timber, the rise and fall of voices, the groan of bellies, the way the seagulls cry less after a certain hour. Time has gone feral, untamed, deliciously vague, and you love it. Of course, there are still jokes. A new one gets passed around. If your beard's grown longer than your patience, it's time to head home. Another. You know it's late when the fish are asking you what time it is. You wonder if, somewhere far in the future, a historian will write these jokes down and mistake them for serious record-keeping. Then again, maybe they are serious, because even if they're silly, they're functional. They create shared reference points. And in a world without hours, or calendars, or alarms, any shared language of time becomes sacred. By the end of the week, or is it the month, you don't even flinch when someone says, feels like it's nearly eyebrow shading time. You simply nod, because of course it is. You smell them before you see them. The air grows thick with something between wet leather, low tide, and old coins. You can't place it, but it clings to your tongue. Then the sound hits you, snorts, bellows, the occasional thunk like a sack of grain falling off a cart. The walruses are back, but this time, it's different. You're not just sailing past a random outcrop with a few lazy lumps basking in the sun. This is a full gathering. Dozens, maybe hundreds, all crammed onto a sprawling shelf of black stone. Their tusks glint, their bodies steam, their voices rise in chorus deep, wet, weirdly organized, and the crew grows quiet. You glance at Avon. He nods slowly. They're early. Leaf spits into the sea. Bad sign. You don't know what it means yet, but you can feel it. This gathering isn't just nature doing its thing. To the crew, it's a sign, a clock chime, a calendar page flipping violently in the wind. This isn't just biology. It's commerce. You've reached a region of the voyage where walrus ivory becomes the real clockwork of time, economically speaking. These creatures aren't just timekeepers anymore. They're currency. Mainstream historians note that Viking trade in walrus ivory boomed around the 10th century, particularly between Norse Greenland and the rest of Europe. Tusk ivory fetched a high price, used for sword hilts, chess pieces, jewelry. Some of it even reached royal courts. And the only way to reliably harvest it, know the when and where of walrus patterns. Suddenly, their predictable hauling times, their seasonal migrations, their strange schedules, they're not just curiosities, they're economic intel. A successful raid or trade mission might hinge on knowing when walruses would gather at a certain beach. Too early, and they're in the sea. Too late, and someone else has claimed the haul. The Vikings became part-time naturalists out of necessity. Tracking walrus colonies wasn't just about food or folklore. It was a calendar of wealth. You step ashore with the crew. No one draws weapons, not yet. These walruses aren't being hunted today. They're being observed. Leaf squats low, near a rock. Third time we've seen them this close before the equinox, he mutters. Wind's off. You don't even question it anymore. And while some of the crew discuss trading opportunities, others begin examining the beach, noting tide marks, the depth of dung piles, and even the rhythm of snorting. It's ridiculous and brilliant. You've somehow landed in the middle of a marine biology seminar where everyone smells like fish and carries an axe. Historians still argue whether this level of observational detail was formalized or passed down through story and superstition. But the fact remains, entire Viking journeys, raids, settlements, supply chains depended on the seasonal reliability of these tusked giants, and when the walruses changed their schedule, it sent ripples through Viking society. You learn that a missed haul-out could mean no ivory. No ivory meant no trade goods. No trade goods meant no coin, no salt, no flour, no winter survival. So, the walrus timetable became the voyage timetable. Their movements, their moods, even their mating calls were studied with the intensity of a man checking the stock market on the morning of a crash. You hear stories that night around the fire of ships that sailed too late and found only bones, of others that arrived early and took tusks by the cartload, of rival crews who tried to fake walrus calls with carved horns, hoping to lure the beasts in early. It never worked, but the walruses didn't seem to mind the attention. Someone jokes about writing the Walrus Almanac. Avon says he already started one knits tattooed on his back. Later, a real trade ship appears. You spot the sail first, then the glint of bronze. They pull alongside your ship cautiously. Greetings are exchanged, goods are displayed, and then, inevitably, someone mentions the walruses, still crowding at Flatback Rock. The stranger asks, Leaf nods grimly. Too early, both ships fall quiet, because everyone understands what that means. The seasons are out of sync. This throws everything into question: when to travel, when to return, when to harvest. And in a society where you can't Google the weather, and your calendar has tusks and flippers, this kind of shift feels seismic. Even the crew's humor turns grim. If the walruses are off, one mutters, maybe we've already missed winter, or maybe winter will never start. That night, you sleep on deck, rocking gently, listening to the low murmurs of walruses still echoing from the distant rocks. They sound less like animals now, and more like bells. But instead of marking the hour, they're tolling for change. You lie awake wondering if all timekeeping is this fragile balanced on the backs of beasts, held together by observation, routine, and a shared belief that the world will continue spinning the same way it always has. Because if the walruses are confused, what happens next? The walruses don't return the next morning. The beach is still. The black rock where they usually lounge glistens with leftover seaweed, patches of crusted dung, and long empty drag marks that vanish into the surf. You stare for a long while, hoping one will pop up, flop onto shore, snort disdainfully, and declare, false alarm. But no one arrives. The crew notices too, though no one says anything for a while. They just move slower. They mutter more. Someone sharpens a knife they don't need yet. Time walrus time has gone silent. You row for hours through a low fog that tastes metallic. Everything feels slightly off-kilter, like your body forgot how to balance on the sea. A gull circles once, twice, then vanishes. Even the ocean seems confused, slapping gently at the hull like it's trying to get your attention. Leaf, finally, breaks the silence. Too warm, he says. He's right. You hadn't really noticed, wrapped in wool and routine. But now, your skin prickles differently. The wind has shifted. It's softer, less biting. A thin film of warmth clings to your neck. It's not their season anymore, Avon adds, almost whispering. But it's too soon. That's the trouble with using animals as timekeepers. They don't always follow the script. Historians still argue whether climate shifts during the Viking Age altered migration patterns of northern animals, especially walruses. Some believe earlier thaws and warmer seas disrupted the usual haul-outs, forcing walruses to shift their behavior and, with them, disrupting entire seasonal routines built around their presence. And if your calendar swims away, you feel it. The crew's mood changes subtly, like the ship is creaking under the weight of uncertainty. Jokes don't land. Meals are quicker. Sleep comes harder. You overhear Torvi mutter that the soup's thickness is off again, boiled down too fast. Used to take longer, she says, stirring with a scowl. You're beginning to realize that everyone on board has some weird little time-sense walrus-based, soup-based, beard-based end. Now that those signals are slipping, so is the crew. You dock at a tiny inlet, rocky and raw, to rest and reorient. The fire is lit, the gear inspected, but people look toward the sea instead of their tasks, like they're waiting for something. A signal, a grunt, a snort from a familiar rock, but the coastline stays quiet. You wander the shoreline with Avent. He shows you the flat stone where they used to count tusk impressions, long furrows left by the massive beasts sliding ashore. Last time we were here, he says, kneeling, they came every third day. Always. You nod. There are no new marks, not even one. In the following days, the crew improvises. They shift their routines. They begin to rely more on the stars. Again, though cloudy skies make that dicey. The shadow board is brought out, but it quivers in uncertain light. They check the winds, read the birds, even measure the depth of moss on their oars. All of it helps a little. None of it replaces the walruses, because walruses were more than just moving timepieces. They were reassurance. Their dependable flops and snores made the world feel predictable. Anchored, now. It feels like the sea has come unmoored. Even the jokes change. You hear someone mutter, maybe they've gone to warn the whales. Another says, what if they're watching us instead? Someone else, quieter, whispers, what if they're right, and we're the ones off schedule? That one chills you. You think back to the earlier parts of this voyage, when the bellowed on cue, when their formations on the rocks were so consistent, they felt like punctuation marks. The middle one twitched. Lunchtime, Scartusk rolled over. Midwatch, those days feel like they belonged to a different world. Now, all your markers are melting. The sky remains stubbornly bright, but it offers no real time. The stars are shy. The ice drifts strange. Even the soup refuses to thicken the way it used to. And so, you watch the water. You watch for snouts, for tusks, for movement on familiar rocks. You start naming the stones lefty flat back, snort peak, to pretend they still matter. But they're all empty. There's a kind of spiritual weight that creeps into the crew. A slow, quiet, the kind that doesn't feel peaceful. It feels like the kind of silence that comes before someone says something awful, or after something important is lost. And then, one morning, Avin doesn't get up. He lies on deck, eyes open, looking at the sky. Dreamt of them, he says softly. They were watching. They knew something we didn't. You lie next to him. You listen to the wind. You realize that in the absence of the walruses, something else has taken their place. Uncertainty, the soft, squishy clocks of the past are gone. And with them, a whole way of understanding the world, of knowing what comes next. You used to feel part of a rhythm. Now you feel like a note, looking for its song. You don't notice it at first. The ship rocks. The crew mutters. The sky is still wearing its permanent overcast. Everything feels the same, until someone says it aloud. It's been 6 days since we saw a walrus. You freeze. That can't be right. But it is. 6 days. 6 days of rowing, without the usual chorus of low barks, echoing off the cliffs. 6 days of guessing when to eat, when to rest, when to pray. 6 days of empty rocks, silent beaches, and time drifting like wood untethered. From its dock, the old rhythms are gone. You wake now not to the call of sea beasts, but to your own heartbeat. You eat when someone else eats. You row when someone grunts. There is no anchor, only motion. Avent has stopped checking the horizon. He whittles, now shaping a tiny wooden walrus with deliberate care. To remember, he says simply, without looking up. You realize you're forgetting what their voices sound like. Back at the beginning of the voyage, their calls felt constant, anchoring a bell toll in the fog. Now, you have to think to hear it in your head. You try to remember the precise timbre, the low gurgle of breath and tusks. It slips away. This is what happens when a clock is erased. Historians still argue over what finally ended the walrus-based rhythms of Viking trade and travel. Climate shift, overhunting, migrations gone awry. All possible, all probable. But the sagas don't record a precise end, just a fading. One day they were there, then they weren't. And the world quietly, and perhaps without realizing, lost a beat. You land on another rocky shore, one indistinguishable from the last, except for the silence, a few birds, some kelp, wind, nothing else. No tusks, no wrinkles, no watchful black eyes. The crew disembarks, less from need and more from muscle memory. They search the beach like pilgrims denied entry to their own temple. Flatback rock is bare, no flippers, no furrows. The stone seems smaller now. Leaf steps forward and rests a hand on it. They've moved on, he says, voice soft. You don't ask where. You already know you won't find them. That night, no one speaks during supper. The fire crackles weakly. The soup is thin, and yet, something happens. Torvi clears her throat. Third day of no walrus, she says. Soup's thinner than usual. Maybe that's a kind of time. Someone chuckles. Another adds, Evan's carving is growing a beard. Laughter. Real, brief, unburdened. Because the walruses may be gone but the habits remain. You still watch the sea. You still note the ice, the birds, the stars. You've begun to make new rituals, without even noticing. A song hummed before rowing, a stretch before sleep. The way someone always checks the moss on the sailcloth, as if it might whisper the hour. The crew has changed. You've all adjusted, reshaped by absence. Maybe the walruses weren't keeping time. Maybe you were projecting it onto their backs, assigning meaning to their snorts, building calendars from their routines. And now that they're gone, you're forced to do it yourself. That's what the Vikings had to do in the end. When the walruses vanished, they adapted. Some followed stars, others built more sophisticated sun compasses, others simply trusted. Their bones, their bellies, their battered memories, and so do you, on your final night at sea. The stars finally come out in full. The clouds part. The water is black and endless. But the sky is filled with pinpricks, dozens, hundreds of tiny, flickering notches in time. The captain charts a course by them. No walrus call tells him when. No bell rings. Just starlight. Just instinct. Just people moving forward. You look back toward the empty rocks. One last time. The tide is high. The stones glisten. Nothing stirs. And still, the ship glides forward. The journey continues. Time doesn't stop. It simply changes shape. So now, as the ship fades into darkness, and the last of the stars overhead blink gently in the hush, you let your breath slow. The waves have softened. The crew is quiet. The world has gone from noisy barks and grunts to the simple rhythm of wood and water and wind. There's no rush now. No bells, no deadlines. Just you, floating through a time that asks nothing from you but patience. Your muscles are sore, but in that good way, like something ancient inside you has stretched and realigned. You've followed walrus time. You've followed instinct time. And now you've drifted gently into dream time. Let your thoughts blur now. Let the rocks and fog and flippers drift away. The walruses are far behind, resting in some other world, on some other shore, where time still follows their pace. You don't need them anymore. You've learned their lesson. Slow down, breathe. Breathe. Trust the rhythm, even when it doesn't make sense. Let your heart beat. Match the seas. Let your eyes get heavier. You've traveled far. You've felt time dissolve, reassemble, and dissolve again. You're not lost. You're just resting. Drift. Now dot, and when you wake, whether in 1 hour or many, you'll know what time it is. It'll be your time. Sweet dreams. Word count 1051 plus wind down 301. End of script. Sweet dreams.